and welcome to the first week on Introduction to Linux. We're going to be talking about some Linux basics. This week, we're going to be talking about the origins of the Linux operating system. We're going to talk about some differences between Linux and Windows, and we're going to talk a little bit about open source, what open source is, and how that relates to Linux. So, Linux was actually a project that really started in the 90s. However, it came from some older work that other people had done. One of the things that's really interesting about the history of Linux and Unix is that it actually goes a lot further back than a lot of people might think. So there was actually some versions, and I almost hesitate to call them computers because a lot of people wouldn't necessarily recognize it as a computer based off of what we're used to seeing as computers now. But there was a creation of a computer system, and that had an operating system with some code. And that actually went all the way back into the 1960s. And some of the evolution that ended up happening was different people worked on it. And then in the 90s, someone named Linus Torvalds actually created this Linux kernel. So he was the first developer and he ended up doing a lot of work on this kernel. So the mascot for the Linux kernel is this cute little penguin that you see here. One of the things that makes this really interesting is for a lot of people in the 90s, they probably would have tried to make some money off of it, but instead, the person that created this actually ended up deciding to release it, and he released it as something called open source. Open source is a way of being able to say, basically, like, here's the code that I've wrote. Let me show you this code so that if you would like to work with it as well, you can do that. And so you can actually have multiple people working on this code that makes up Linux. And that also means that it can be freely shared because if the source code is open, it can go to anybody in the world. And one of the things that's really nice about opening it up like that is anybody, everybody is able to actually go look at the code, work with the code, and start seeing what they could do, what they wanted with it. Now, you may or may not have heard of Linux specifically before. Some of the common things that you'll see Linux getting used for. Well, I will say one of the most common is actually phones. So, a lot of you probably have an Android phone, and that's actually a Linux based phone. That's one of the most common ways that the general public will see and use Linux is this Android phone. Another common usage of Linux might be the command line. And if you have something with multiple users or you have maybe not as much ability to have lots of things going over the internet, so like if you have really poor internet, you may want to do things on the command line. And so that's another case where Linux is actually a really great choice. Now, GUIs or graphical user interfaces is something that you will sometimes see Linux being used for. So for example, the way that you're interacting with your phone is a graphical user interface, and you'll see Linux being used for that. One of the other, I would say, most common places that you see Linux is actually on servers on the World Wide Web or the internet right now. So what ends up happening on the internet is when you go to a web page, you have to have a server that is hosting this web page. So basically, your browser is saying, hey, I would like to go look at, for example, Wikipedia. And then the server is able to say, oh, yes, I see that you would like to look at this article on Wikipedia. Let me show you this article. And it's the server that's actually doing that. And a lot of these servers actually run Linux. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages of Linux. One of the advantages is Linux is, by definition, more secure. Now, part of the reason that it's more secure is because it's so uncommonly used as a desktop machine. If you're going to see viruses in Linux, normally the viruses are server attacks. But some of it is also the way that Linux was actually designed and put together, and the way that permissions were done and installs were done and the defaults are set up. It actually makes it a more secure system than Windows. Another pro of Linux is that it's designed to be multi user. So, if you have a lot of people that are going to be accessing a system, for example, a server, Linux was actually designed with that in mind, so it handles that a lot better than some other systems might. The maintenance is another way that Linux is actually really nice. The updates that you can do, the patches that you can do, the fixes that you can do. It's not only a little bit easier to update and maintain because Linux is open source. You can also write your own patches and do a lot of your own maintenance. You're really not beholden to somebody else. Now, this does come with a con that because you're not beholden to somebody else or a company, you also might not have support. So, for example, if you are running a Windows machine, then you're probably used to Patch Tuesdays, where somebody will basically just push out an update. Your computer updates whether you want it to or not, and then it is supposedly more secure. Now, when this works, that's great. Your computer is more secure. Everybody's very happy. When this doesn't work, it's less great because now your computer doesn't work and you don't know why and you don't have any control over it and you hope they fix it in the next update. Another disadvantage to Linux is because it's not particularly popular, especially for desktops. It's very popular for servers, it's very popular for phones, but for general desktops, it's not very popular. Software availability can be a problem. Now, it's not as bad as it was, 20 years ago. Like 20 years ago, trying to find programs for my Linux computer was actually kind of a pain. Now it's actually a lot easier to not just find them, but also find them, find updates, and do the install for them. However, there's still a lot of software that is absolutely just not available on Linux. For example, if you are a gamer, they probably don't make your favorite game for Linux. A lot of people assume that everybody uses Windows, so a lot of the software that you're going to see is going to have a Windows walkthrough and a Windows install and Windows executable and stuff, which is lovely if you're doing that, but if you're not, then you may end up with not being able to use the software that you need to. I would actually put this in either the pro and con category because, oh no, I can't use this brand new software that I don't want to use because it doesn't work on my system. Well, gosh darn, I guess I'm just going to miss out. Now, open source software. The sort of general ethos of open source software. There's a couple of different things happening here. When we talk about open source software, we're talking about sharing our software with others. There's actually different licenses behind this. One of the things that you'll see, especially on the internet where everybody has an opinion, is there are some people that are very, we'll say, militantly open source. It must be open source or they refuse to use it. Some people don't care. Some people care about the cost. Most open source stuff tends to be free. If you're going to, for example, have an open source project, you have to share your source code. However, you do not have to support it. So, one of the things that people do is actually say, here's the program, here's the code, here's, everything. But you have to pay me for the support. And that's how some of the developers will do things. Some of it's also a community based thing where people will volunteer their time to make projects better. And there's this sort of attitude within the community of, well, if I'm going to be writing this for me, I would like to share this with others. Maybe other people would find this useful. Sometimes there can also be some issues and drama, just like with any other community, but In general, I would say that open source is a really nice thing when you are able to do it, being able to share your source code with others so that they can see what you've done, they can build on your work, other people can see maybe some interesting advances that you've had. Is all really nice. Another thing that's really nice about open source work is it's available to a wider population. If you are listening to this video, you are probably in a country that has relatively good access to the internet, relatively good access to computer systems, and you may not have as much money as you would like, but you probably do have those things. Now, one of the things that open source can mean is this software that people are using, we can actually share it with others without charging them. So it's a nice way of being able to get software and hardware and shared programs to other people that may have not been able to afford it. For example, if we think about like a Windows license, well, if a Windows license is $200 or $300, or if you have some of the Adobe stuff that's, $100 a month or whatever, for some people, they might be able to do that really easily without a problem. For some people, $100 might be what they make in 2 months, and so they like literally couldn't afford that because their entire salary is $50 a month. So it is nice to be able to share what you've done, what you've worked on, and part of the community aspect to open source is sharing that with others whenever you can and wherever you can. So that's kind of an introduction to Linux and open source software and a little bit on the history of Linux. I hope you are all having a lovely day, and I will see you again later.